Do you want to know how to teach kids to be quiet in church? You're not alone. There's a lot of parents hoping for a little bit more peace on the Sabbath. I'm Nicholeen Peck, and I teach all over the world about parenting, good communication, how to build strong family bonds, child development, education, all through the lens of the principle of self-government. And in this video, we're talking about a little bit more peace at church. In this video, we're going to be talking about the nature of the problem and what it's like to experience that behavior where people are not being quiet in church, what that does to everybody else and to the child, and what to do to help fix the problem. Who doesn't love an active child, right? The active 15-year-old, the active 5-year-old, the active 5-month-old. It's a tricky thing to take them to a place where they have to practice using their attention span, and they have to focus in, and they have to be still, and they have to be quiet. This can be difficult. Now, in this video, I know that some people probably do have teens or people that struggle staying quiet in church, but they're a lot easier to correct. It's the little teeny ones, the little toddlers that are really the struggle for most people. So I'm going to spend most of my energy there as I'm talking about staying quiet in church. But hey, if the principles apply to your 15-year-old, use them there as well. Because if a principle is a principle, it should apply to everyone. So let's talk about what it looks like. I've got little grandchildren right now. They're all tiny, little toddlers and babies. I know what it's like when they are in church and they're, wanting to climb all over things, and they're wanting to talk and saying, "Grandma, let me wear your watch. Grandma, do you have a book? Grandma, can I see your keys?" They want to touch something. They want to do something, right? And of course, you want to give them that something to hopefully shut them down. But guess what I've found is that as soon as you start giving them all the things or talking back to them, they just talk more. There was an experience I had just a little while back in church where there was a father who was talking to his child. The child was not doing much of anything, but then the father started saying, "Hey, we need to be quiet about this." And then suddenly the child started talking back. Then the father started talking back. Before I know it, they're having this conversation about different things in the church. And the father's like, "Look at that, look at that." And he's trying to distract the child. And I'm thinking to myself, at this point, we now have the father that's being more distracting than the child, which absolutely can happen sometimes. So we've got to be very careful that we don't fall into the trap of talking back to the child just because they're talking a lot during church. Now, to some degree, I think people are pretty merciful and understanding when you have babies and toddlers. They know that it's a long sit to sit in a church service for an hour and have to, try to be quiet and pay attention. I know some people bring little quiet books or little, snuggly stuffed animals or something to hold on to. I was never one that brought tons of toys to church. We did have a couple of church books that the children could look at pictures of Jesus and some different scripture things they could play, some quiet activities. It was like a little fabric type quiet book that they could use a little bit. But other than that, we really didn't do much. We didn't get out all the paper and crayons and those types of things very much. And we definitely didn't bring toys to church because I actually wanted to teach my children that they could learn the skill of sitting there. And as long as you give them too many diversions, they actually think they don't have to learn the skill of sitting there. So teaching a person to be patient and sit is actually something you have to deliberately teach. So what we did was we practiced sitting still at home for little periods of time and doing things, looking at a little book or sitting next to me while I looked at a book or singing a song together so that they could have that experience practicing the skill of being still. That was something that proved to be very beneficial. I call this type of teaching or training pre-teaching. Whenever you are deliberate in your actions and you want to make a change in your direction or your behavior for the future, pre-teaching is the most effective thing to do for yourself. So I believe in pre-teaching children. Also, toddlers' prefrontal cortexes are so very small that they need to have repetition. They need to be consistently trained on a singular thing before it finally sticks. They have to see that particular problem being solved the same in multiple circumstances before they decide it's something that they're going to do for the long term. So for toddlers, pre-teaching is the key. If you want your child to be successful, you tell them ahead of time what's coming. So what does that look like with church? Well, for many years, every Sunday morning before we would go off for church, my husband and I would gather the children around us. We would talk about what the church environment was going to be like at church and how they needed to follow instructions and accept no answers, and how they needed to act when they were seating on the pew and when the church talks and the musical numbers were going on, what they needed to do, how they could participate, and how they needed to wait for other people to participate. Then with these discussions, we would talk about the positive consequences after church for good behavior in church and the negative consequences for after church if they did not have good behavior in church. Also, we would talk about what would happen right in the moment if a person was going to be disruptive in the church. We told them that we would say, okay, so if you are starting to act up and be noisy or do something you shouldn't in the church, and we would list what those things were, then we will tell you that's a no answer. If you choose not to accept that no answer, then we will correct you and we will tell you, okay, what you just did not accept a no answer, this is what you should do, and you've earned this extra chore, and it's going to happen after church. But if they still maintained that type of behavior, then they would know that we would take them out of the chapel area or the sanctuary area, and we would take them to another room, and we would just sit with them there so that they could sit there until they were going to be quiet. And so they had to sit by us, alone, in a room where nothing was going on, and it was completely quiet. Now that was way worse than sitting in the chapel and listening to the service. So then after they got quiet, we would take them back. We didn't walk them around the church or divert them with the drinking fountain and toys somewhere else. No, because then they wouldn't want to stay in the chapel and listen, and we had to teach them how to do that skill. So we did tell the children that after church there would be some sort of a treat. Maybe we would make cookies some weeks, or maybe have some ice cream or something. But after church, as part of our lunch, there would be a treat for people who were being quiet at church. It didn't take very much time for the young ones to recognize that they really weren't going to get a treat if they didn't choose to be quiet at the church. And so they started choosing to learn that skill and be quiet at the church. That was their negative consequence, and they ended up following through really well. I remember one day an older woman in the congregation came up to me and said, "Your children are so well behaved during church service. I can't believe that. When my children were young, they didn't behave that well during church service." Her saying that was quite a compliment, especially knowing how busy and active my children are. But I said to her, well, we just talk about church at home before we ever even come to church, so we prepare them. And she said, why didn't I ever think of that? So pre-teaching is the key, but also we're going to want to follow through with good praise, good corrections as needed for feedback with the children. Now we are just barely talking about a few key things about self-government. We've mentioned things like following instructions, accepting no answers, but I haven't given you the steps for those things. But I'd like to do that now. So there is a video called The Not So Known Secret for Parenting Success. It's a full-length class that has the steps to those 4 basic skills in it, and I think it will be very beneficial for you. So click on the link to that video next. I'll see you there.